So we'll kick things off with HTML tables. So when we say table, we're referring to a data table, two-dimensional rows and column structure, right? Tabular data, usually a nice, clear way of displaying some data. Not everything lends itself to a table. Here's a very simple one. We've got, one row and two columns. I'm sure on MDN they have some slightly more complicated examples. Here's a much larger one on Wikipedia. This is a table, a tabular structure. We've got rows and columns. We have headers, and it's actually more complicated than just having headers. We have subheaders, or I'm not sure how you would want to call what you would call this, but we've got a header city proper that then has three types or three pieces of information within that one category. Same thing with urban area and metro area. Anyway, it's a much more complicated table. We have links inside. We've got a nice hover effect. That's all CSS there. We've got images. This is one example of a table. Still, it looks very tabular, table-y, not that attractive, in my opinion. But here's something that you might see. I was actually looking for a mattress recently, and I always try and find examples like this when I'm teaching. Here's an example of an actual table. This is, if we inspect, it's a table element to compare different mattresses on Casper in this case. And this is not an endorsement of Casper. I haven't gotten my mattress yet. I have no idea if it's any good or not. But anyway, you can see we have rows and columns. It's just been styled very differently, so it looks nicer, but it still is a table. And I can actually inspect and prove that. Here we are, table. Now, what goes in a table is a much longer topic. That's what we'll talk about in the next video, because there are quite a few elements. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about the history of tables. So back in the day, in the 90s, and probably into the early 2000s, tables were actually used to lay out websites. So when I say layout, I mean to move content or position content around, which is still honestly a little bit trickier than you might hope, but it's way better now than it used to be. So back in the 90s, it was difficult to move something to the top, or to have three elements, split space, or to have text over here and two buttons next to each other, and then a bunch of this text down on the bottom. Whatever the layout is, it was not that easy. So tables were used, and there are a few examples of this still. This is the old Bob Dole 96 campaign website. I'm amazed some of these things are still up. And if you look at it, this right here, actually I think all of this might be a table. This is not a great use of a table anymore, and it's not something that you really should do. Tables should be reserved for tabular data, for rows and columns of information that you're trying to display in a tabular format, not just to lay out your content. But here we go. This whole thing is a table. Same thing with this lovely old Space Jam website. This whole thing right there, that is a table. And then within that table, we have a bunch of elements that we have yet to discuss, but developers like to use them back in the early days of web design, because you could make a bunch of cells and make them take up dead space in between. As you can see here, right, there are some empty cells and space in each cell. Each one has a width and a height, and it's very janky, but it did work and it still works. It's just not best practice these days. So these days we should use tables for things like this or this here, where we're actually showing information that lends itself to the tabular format. So that about wraps it up for this intro. Tables, rows and columns. They used to be used to lay websites out. You shouldn't do that anymore. And the last point that you'll soon see is that there are quite a few different elements that can go into a table. We're going to go over them. You don't need to memorize or remember all of them, but I'm just going to show them all to you. That's coming up next.